Today I want to talk about a word that comes up a lot in discussions about science fiction, and the word is prescience. It's a term for a quality in a given work, a sense that the work foresaw aspects of the present. When we talk about books like 1984 and we say that they are prescient, we're talking about the way that book seemed to predict the total surveillance state, one that we're now seemingly willingly opting into instead of being strong-armed into. Now, there's many works of science fiction I could single out for having an uncanny degree of prescience, and the way that manifests with each work is completely different. For instance, in The Stars My Destination, which I talked about before on this channel, that book satirically envisions a future lorded over by corporate conglomerates that function like feudal dynasties. And then you have John Brunner, whose work is getting some overdue recognition, and he wrote about overpopulation and environmental destruction in books like The Sheep Look Up and Stand on Zanzibar. But in his book, The Shockwave Rider, which was written in the early 1970s, he envisioned not just the internet, but WikiLeaks. It's like the old adage goes, good science fiction imagines the flying car, great science fiction imagines the airborne traffic jam. But the reason I want to talk about prescience today is not to say that it is a goal that you should aim for in your own science fiction work. You see, I don't actually feel that it is science fiction's job to predict things. I think whatever we believe the future is going to consist of is always going to be a product of our current speculations about the present, extrapolated forward. And those are almost always severely blinkered. See, a while back, I talked about a book titled, But What If We're Wrong? That unpacks this idea in detail. And one of the things I got out of it is that our track record for predicting the future generally, and science fiction track record in particular for the sake of this discussion, is more wrong than right. Prescience about the future is a sliding window. It changes as we move forward through time. And we can talk about where we think things might end up. But, this is my point, we don't have to be right about where things end up for our speculations to be entertaining or even for them to be useful. The speculations just have to be as vivid and specific as possible and let everything else take care of itself. One of my favorite works of science fiction is Neuromancer by William Gibson. I really need to sit down and do a separate video about this at some point. It is now about some 40 plus years old, and it's being made into an Apple TV series, and I'm really curious to see how they adapt it, in big part because the future it envisioned has come true in some respects, but not others. The flavor of what it envisioned is more accurate for me than most of the details, like the idea that corporations and capital would displace governments, or that digital technology would create its own pocket universe and its own criminal underworld. Those things are all spot on. They seem more relevant than ever. And a lot of why they still land so well is again because Gibson brought them to life with vivid, specific details. He made this future seem concrete from the inside. Most of us are not going to be anything like Case, the digital cowboy protagonist of Neuromancer, but we're living in a world that looks a lot more like his world than the world Gibson lived in at the time he wrote the book. The way he responds to his world becomes that much more the way we respond to ours. So what we should be doing rather than predicting, I think, is just setting up speculations and then making the consequences of those speculations come to life as vividly and specifically as we can. And if some of those speculations turn out to be spot on, great, that's a bonus. But that shouldn't be the goal, because the future is open-ended and inherently difficult, if not outright impossible, to predict. Being prescient in some respect or other about the future is a good add-on, but it's not the job. It's about making what we speculate about have an inner life of its own, to make it feel like it's dispatches from a lived-in place. Another favorite piece of SF of mine that's kept its prescient flavor and hasn't aged anywhere nearly as much as I thought it might is the movie Strange Days, which came out in 1995. I covered that in detail in a previous video. And some of why it's aged well is because the technology in the film hasn't come to pass yet. We don't yet have a device that can record or play back sensory experiences. So that aspect of the movie has a long way from being dated. And all of the other stuff, the racial tensions, the political aspects, the sociology, all of those remain relevant decades later. I should also point out that prescience is not just a quality of science fiction, but of fiction in general. And one good example of this is the book and movie Fight Club. The movie's 25 years old, the book is even older than that, but they both still have a disturbing amount to say about toxic masculinity that's only now getting wider discussion. And I'm saying all this while admitting that I am not a fan of the material. and why that's the case would easily be its own essay. But I can't argue with how the ideas it tries to tackle are getting only more important with time. And that brings me to another note that I want to bring up about prescience, about its significance. And that's by way of these two last things I've touched on, Fight Club and Strange Days. Prescience is a two-way street. And what I mean by that is prescience is not just a measure of how good a particular work was at predicting what might come. It's also a measure of our own progress along that dimension. And progress is not guaranteed. The gains of one generation can be lost by the next. The fact that Strange Days or Fight Club still have relevance because of their political and sociological dimensions is not just a sign of how well those works were made or how accurately they foresaw things. It's also a sign of how badly the rest of us have fared. So when we say something is prescient, we're saying at least as much about where we are now and where we expected to be by now as we are about the thing that was being prescient. Our ideas about the future change over time. And one of the big changes that's taken place, I think, is that we're much less naive about progress being automatic than we were even a decade ago. And I'd like to think that's an insight we can harness for good, that we can actively make things better instead of just passively waiting for them to get better because that's what we expect. We should use our speculations about the past as an index for how our ideas about the future have changed and continue to change. So again, don't take any of this as a sign that your job with writing science fiction is to predict what's going to happen. It's more about imagining what could happen and how we can use that same power of imagination, the same willingness to realize future possibilities, to deal with what does come. The more we can imagine, whether or not it plays out the way we imagined, the more imagination we have, the more practice we'll have at imagining. And the more kinds of futures we can imagine, the more possible futures we may be able to bring into existence. And believe me, we could sure use them.